Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to my thesis presentation. The last couple of months, I had the pleasure of working with Jan Ter, my supervisor, and he gave me a research topic, which grew out to the following research question. Oh, even dit aan de kant. Okay. How effectively can the role of epigenetic modification due to childhood abuse with relation to ASPD be modeled using an adaptive self-modeling dynamic network? So when you look at this question, there are four main topics, which I will further explain in the next slides. And the reason that I chose to combine these topics in my research is because there is a lot of research available that supports the association of DNA methylation in the MAOA gene with child abuse and the development of ASPD. There's also a lot of research available on first order and second order adaptive networks, but there's still very little research available on adaptive networks of higher orders. Treur and also Katusing and colleagues have done research on these higher adaptive networks, and that inspired me to build on their work and make my own fifth order adaptive network, which I will show later. So first, what is ASPD? It is short for antisocial personality disorder, which is a mental disorder that, according to the DSM-5, has the following diagnostic criterion: a disregard for the violation of others' rights, impulsive and aggressive behavior, and the partaking in repetitive criminal behavior. Now, what has this to do with childhood abuse? There's a lot of research available that found association between those diagnosed with ASPD and a past exposure to childhood abuse. Most studies that use the term childhood abuse define it as sexual and/or physical abuse by a family member or a parental figure. Epigenetics is a research field in biology that investigates changes in the gene expression without altering a DNA sequence. And DNA methylation is a form of epigenetic modification that alters the gene expressiveness, and it has been found that this alteration also alters the phenotype and behavior of individuals. And studies have confirmed that environmental factors such as childhood abuse can be at the cause for DNA methylation to occur. Earlier, I mentioned shortly the MAOA gene. MAOA stands for monoamine oxidase, and there's a variant A, which is an enzyme that is involved in degradation of the neurotransmitter serotonin. You can see the process in this picture. There are several variants of this MAOA gene. There's a short variant and a long variant. It has been found that DNA methylation in the short variant is associated with childhood abuse and development of ASPD. So Treur introduced temporal causal networks to model mental and biological processes, among other things. And these networks have the following characteristics: connectivity, aggregation, and timing. So if we look at the graph over here, we can see that there is, for example, an arrow pointing from state 3 to 4. And this represents the connectivity, and it has a connection weight to it. Then the aggregation represents the causal impact of states amongst each other. If we look at the graph, you see that state 3 has two incoming arrows from state 1 and 2. And the aggregational impact of these states that these states have on 3 is combined into one single value, which then changes the value of state 3. The speed to which states adapt when affected by other states is regulated by a speed factor. All the states in this network, they are assigned a speed factor, and the speed factor is represented by the eta sign over here. And so this combined with all the other characteristics forms this equation. And it's important to note that when a simulation is run in the software, at every time step, the values of all these states will be recalculated. So when we look at this network and we don't take into account state 6, it is a temporal causal network. In order to make such a network adaptive, we can choose any of the characteristics as described before, and we can add another state for it. So this is what happens when we add state 6. State 6 represents the connection weight between state 3 and 4. It would be possible to also make a similar state to represent the weights between 4 and 5, for example. Okay, so in order to make an adaptive network for my research, I made these two scenarios, and these scenarios are based on the research that I presented in the previous slides. So scenario 1 is that of person H, which is a male carrier of the long NOA allele, and is not exposed to childhood abuse. Because of this, there is no DNA methylation, and so this person does also not develop ASPD. And therefore, there's also no exhibit of impulsive and aggressive behavior in a social setting. An example for a social setting can be that person H is, for example, standing in a queue, waiting to enter a building, and all of a sudden, a person from behind person H jumps the queue and gets in front of him. This can be experienced for person H as annoying, irritable behavior. But since person H did not develop ASPD, the behavior regulation processes of person H are not altered, and so person H does not exhibit any aggressive behavior towards the person that jumped the queue. Person L, however, is kind of the polar opposite of this person. He, as a carrier of the short NOA allele, he has been exposed to childhood abuse, therefore also has DNA methylation. He has developed ASPD and therefore also has exhibits impulsive aggressive behavior in a social setting. When we remember the example that I gave in the previous slide, I used the same principle for my graphical representation of the network. For example, this state over here represents the connection that is between these two states. My network consists of 5 self-modeling levels, where the base level represents the childhood abuse and the behavior. It's important to note that I chose to represent the presence of childhood abuse as a stress regulation network. So if you look here, there is a context state for high stress and a context state for low stress. The context state for high stress indicates that there is a presence of childhood abuse, and the other one indicates that there is no presence of it. The state up in green, that one regulates the epigenetic change, and the states below it regulates the serotonin production, which then influence this lower network, which regulates the behavior of a person. If we remember the calculation that I showed before with the aggregational impact, it is possible to choose for every state a different type of function for this. For this, I chose the logistic, step mod, and step one's functions. And so for every time step, the values of all these states will be calculated using one of these functions. Then the results. So the results for scenario 1 are presented in this simulation. I have to check a second. So the described social setting, as I described before, is represented by the blue line that is from time step 50 to time step 250. It goes up and down. This means that it's present during these time steps. And secondly, the fact that person H is not exposed to childhood abuse means that the stress levels of this person are low. As I mentioned before, here, this con-stress state gives the context of this low levels of stress. And in the simulation, this is represented by the bright green line, which is present from time step 100 to 200. So this makes that the important part of the simulation happens between time step 100 to 200, because this is the point where person H is being exposed to the irritable behavior of the person jumping the queue while being in a context of low levels of stress. And if we go back to the graph, we can see that the final state is state ESA. This state represents the antisocial behavior in the individual. And if we look in the agenda, it's presented by a pink line, which is this one. If we look between the time step 100 and 200, we see that the value of the pink line stays very low throughout the complete simulation. And this can be interpreted as that there is barely any antisocial behavior present in person H. And this follows the scenario that we made for person H. Then for scenario 2, we can already see that the simulation is a bit different. It's important to note that in this simulation, person L does experience childhood abuse. And so that is represented by a high stress context, which is represented by the red line, which is this one. It's a bit harder to see, but it's present from time step 0 to 100. And so the important part here of the simulation is between time step 50 to 100, because at this time, you have the blue line, which represents the irritable behavior of the other person, which is then present. So that means that person L is then triggered by this behavior while being in a context of high stress levels. And if we then look again at the pink line, which is there, which starts from time step 50, which represents the antisocial behavior, we see now that the value of the pink line skyrockets into 0.82. And if we go back to the results before, where the line stayed at a value around 0.18, this is a massive change, which was also expected. Then lastly, it's also important to note that once the context of childhood abuse is absent, so at time step 100, we see the green line come up again, and this green line is the same green line that we see here. So that is the context of normal stress levels. And this can be interpreted as that as person L grows up, he might not be in an environment anymore that is abusive, and he became an adult. And this means that the stress levels of this person L will also go down. The stress levels are represented by these lines. So for example, the purple and the yellow one, we see that during this interval, these levels are very high and they kind of lower here to values that are very similar to person H. So that's these levels. But important to notice that despite these stress levels going down, when you look at the pink line of antisocial behavior, you see that this one remains constant at a level of 0.82. And this means that the antisocial behavior of person L remains present even when the environmental factors change. So this is consistent with the research that I presented in previous slides, which say that childhood abuse basically is a moderator to DNA methylation and ASPD. So when we consider the previous presented results, the self-modeling method used in this paper is effective for the modeling of the role of epigenetic modification in the context of childhood abuse. It's important to note that the current network is inspired on the researches that I presented. And there's also research available that found contradicting results to these researches. This means that the topic of MBOA and ASPD is still an incomplete field, some research found contradicting results. However, my research does not seek to prove the validity of the underlying research, but rather whether the research can be modeled effectively. So taking that into account, my research has been successful. Then I also want to point out the comorbidities of ASPD. It has been argued that ASPD, that the diagnosis of ASPD is a bit too over-inclusive. There's a lot of so that is too over-inclusive because there's a lot of overlap in symptoms of ASPD with other mental disorders. So when you're doing research on people with ASPD, it's difficult to exclude the possible factor that there might be symptoms from other mental disorders that also are at play. And then lastly, I want to note that I also found another paper on a dopamine transporter gene. This paper states that low activity levels of this transporter gene leads to poor decision-making in people with ASPD. And it could be interesting to add that for future research to the network as well, to make the network more complete. But yeah, that might be for future research. Interesting. So yeah, that was my thesis presentation.